The rope felt coarse against Elizabeth Hart's neck as she stood on the wooden platform in Willow Creek's dusty town square. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gathered crowd, their faces a mixture of curiosity and bloodlust. Some had come for justice, others for spectacle, but all had come to watch a widow hang. Liza's hands were bound behind her back, but her spine remained straight, her green eyes defiant as they swept across the sea of faces below. 6 months ago, she'd been a respected member of this community, a rancher's wife with land, status, and a future. Now she stood accused of murdering her own husband, branded a killer by the very people who once called her neighbor. Elizabeth Hart, Sheriff Coleman's voice boomed across the square, reading from a crumpled paper. You have been found guilty of the willful murder of your husband, Thomas Hart, by poison. Do you have any last words? Liza lifted her chin higher, her voice carrying clear and strong over the crowd. I am innocent of this crime, and someday the truth will see light. In the distance, a lone rider crested the hill overlooking Willow Creek, his horse kicking up dust as he rode hard toward town. 6 months earlier, the Hart Ranch had been a picture of prosperity. Rolling green pastures stretched as far as the eye could see, fed by the crystal-clear waters of Willow Creek that wound through the property like a silver ribbon. The land was rich, the cattle fat, and the future bright for Thomas and Elizabeth Hart. Thomas had been a good man, steady, hard-working, and devoted to the ranch his father had carved out of the Colorado wilderness. At 42, he was 14 years older than Liza, but their marriage had been built on mutual respect and shared dreams. He'd courted her properly, married her in the little church on Main Street, and given her a life she'd never imagined possible for an orphan girl from back east. That October morning started like any other. Liza was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, while Thomas headed out to check the north pasture. The creek had been running higher than usual due to early autumn rains, and he wanted to make sure the cattle weren't getting too close to the swollen banks. Be careful out there, Liza had called after him, standing in the doorway, with flour on her apron and worry in her eyes. That creek's moving fast today. Thomas had turned back to smile at her, his weathered face crinkling at the corners. Don't you worry about me, darling. I've been riding these lands since before you were born. A little water never hurt anybody. Those were the last words her husband ever spoke to her. When Thomas's horse returned alone 2 hours later, Liza knew something was terribly wrong. She saddled her own mare and rode out to find him, her heart pounding with dread. She found Thomas face down in the creek, his body caught against a fallen log, his horse's hoofprints telling the story of a spooked animal and a tragic fall. Dr. Williams had examined the body and declared it an accidental death. Thomas had likely been thrown from his horse when it spooked at something, maybe a snake, maybe just the rushing water, and struck his head on the rocks as he fell. Such accidents were common in ranching country, and nobody questioned the doctor's findings. Nobody except Colonel James Morgan. Morgan owned the largest spread in the territory, a sprawling empire of cattle and influence that stretched across 3 counties. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and what he wanted was the Hart Ranch. Specifically, he wanted the water rights that came with it. The first visit came a week after the funeral. Liza was still wearing black when Morgan's carriage rolled up to her front door, accompanied by 2 of his ranch hands. The colonel was a distinguished man in his 50s, with silver hair and calculating blue eyes that missed nothing. Mrs. Hart, he'd said, removing his hat as he stepped onto her porch, please accept my condolences on your tragic loss. Thomas was a good man. Thank you, Colonel, Liza had replied, though something in his manner set her on edge. That's very kind of you to say. I'll come straight to the point, Morgan continued, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. A woman alone on a ranch this size? Well, it's not safe, not practical. I'd like to make you an offer for the property. A generous offer. Liza's back had stiffened. The ranch isn't for sale, Colonel Morgan. Everything's for sale at the right price, my dear. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000, cash money, enough to set you up comfortably anywhere you'd like to go. It was a substantial sum, more than the ranch was worth by most measures. But Liza knew why Morgan wanted it so badly. The Hart Ranch controlled the headwaters of Willow Creek, the primary water source for the entire valley. Whoever owned that land controlled the water, and whoever controlled the water controlled everything else. I appreciate the offer, Liza had said firmly, but this is my home. I'm not leaving. Morgan's smile had grown cold. I hope you'll reconsider, Mrs. Hart. A woman in your position, well, you might find life rather difficult without a man's protection. That had been the first threat, though it was couched in politeness. Over the following weeks, the pressure had intensified. Morgan's men began cutting across her property, claiming easement rights that didn't exist. Her cattle went missing, just a few at first, then larger numbers. Fences were cut, water troughs mysteriously contaminated, and her ranch hands began receiving better offers from other employers. One by one, Liza watched her hired men ride away, leaving her alone on a ranch too large for one person to manage. When she tried to hire replacements, she found that word had somehow spread that the Hart Ranch was unlucky, dangerous, not a good place for honest men to work. Still, Liza refused to sell. She learned to do the work herself, rising before dawn to tend the cattle, mend fences, and keep the ranch running. Her hands grew calloused, her back ached, and her savings dwindled. But her resolve never wavered. This was her land, her home, and she'd be damned if she'd let James Morgan scare her away from it. The accusations started in late winter. Subtle at first, whispered conversations that stopped when she entered the general store. Meaningful glances exchanged when she passed on the street. Dr. Williams, who had pronounced Thomas's death accidental, suddenly began expressing doubts about his initial findings. I've been thinking about your husband's death, he told her one February afternoon when she came to town for supplies. Some of the symptoms I observed, well, they're consistent with certain types of poisoning. Liza had stared at him in shock. Poisoning? Dr. Williams, you examined him yourself. You said it was an accident. I said it appeared to be an accident, the doctor corrected, his eyes not quite meeting hers. But I've been consulting with colleagues in Denver, and they've raised some troubling questions. Perhaps we should exhume the body, conduct a more thorough examination. The suggestion hit Liza like a physical blow. You want to dig up my husband? For the sake of justice, Mrs. Hart, surely you want to know the truth. But Liza was beginning to suspect that truth had very little to do with what was happening in Willow Creek. When she looked into Dr. Williams' eyes, she saw the same calculation she'd seen in Morgan's. The look of a man who'd been bought and paid for. The exhumation took place on a cold March morning. Liza stood at her husband's graveside, watching strangers violate the peace she'd tried to build around his memory. Dr. Williams emerged from his examination with grim satisfaction, announcing that he'd found traces of arsenic in Thomas's system. Enough to kill a man, he declared to the assembled crowd. This was no accident. This was murder. All eyes turned to Liza, the grieving widow who stood to inherit everything. In a town where women were expected to be helpless without their husbands, her refusal to sell the ranch suddenly seemed suspicious. Her competence became evidence of premeditation, her strength proof of guilt. Within a week, Sheriff Coleman had issued a warrant for her arrest. The trial was a foregone conclusion, the verdict predetermined by men who'd already decided her fate. And now, as the rope settled around her neck, Liza understood exactly how far James Morgan was willing to go to get what he wanted. But in the distance, dust was rising on the horizon, and a rider was coming fast. The arrest had come at dawn on a Tuesday morning in early April. Liza was in the barn tending to her remaining cattle when Sheriff Coleman and 3 deputies surrounded the building. Their boots echoed ominously on the wooden floor as they approached, hands resting on their gun butts. Elizabeth Hart, Sheriff Coleman announced, his voice lacking its usual warmth. You're under arrest for the murder of your husband, Thomas Hart. Liza had known this moment was coming. The whispers in town had grown louder, the accusations bolder. Dr. Williams's revised findings had given Morgan's conspiracy the legitimacy it needed, and Sheriff Coleman, a man who owed his position to influential backers, was all too willing to play his part. On what evidence? Liza had demanded, though she knew the answer. Arsenic poisoning, Coleman replied, producing iron shackles. Doc Williams found enough poison in your husband's body to kill 3 men, and seeing as how you're the only one who had access to his food. The logic was circular and damning. Thomas had been poisoned, Liza was his wife, therefore Liza was guilty. No one mentioned that arsenic was commonly used to treat cattle diseases, that any rancher would have access to it. No one questioned why a woman planning to murder her husband would choose such an easily detected method. The conclusion had been reached before the investigation began. The jail cell in Willow Creek was small and damp, with a single barred window that looked out onto the main street. From there, Liza could watch the town go about its daily business, see the people she'd once considered neighbors and friends cross the street to avoid walking too close to the building that held the accused murderess. Colonel Morgan visited her on the third day of her incarceration. He arrived with fanfare, his polished boots clicking on the jail's wooden floor, his presence filling the small space with an aura of power and menace. "Mrs. Hart," he said, settling into a chair that Sheriff Coleman had hastily provided, "I do hope you're reconsidering my offer." Liza remained standing, her hands gripping the cell bars. "I have nothing to reconsider, Colonel. I'm innocent of the charges against me." Morgan's laugh was cold and calculating. "Innocence is a luxury you can no longer afford, my dear. The evidence against you is quite compelling. Dr. Williams is prepared to testify that your husband died of arsenic poisoning. Mrs. Henderson will swear she saw you purchasing rat poison just weeks before Thomas's death. And young Billy Patterson is ready to tell the court about the argument he overheard between you and your husband the day he died." Each revelation hit Liza like a physical blow. Mrs. Henderson had indeed sold her rat poison for the very real rat problem in the barn. And yes, she and Thomas had argued that morning about his insistence on riding out alone to check the swollen creek. But these innocent facts were being twisted into evidence of premeditation and motive. "Why?" Liza whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" Morgan leaned forward, his blue eyes cold as winter ice. "Because you're standing in the way of progress, Mrs. Hart. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad wants to run a line through this valley. They need water rights, grazing lands, and a terminus for their operations. Your little ranch sits right in the middle of their planned route." The truth hit Liza like a thunderbolt. This wasn't just about Morgan's greed. It was about the railroad, about money and power on a scale she'd never imagined. Her water rights were worth millions to the right buyers, and she was the only thing standing between them and their fortune. "The railroad will bring prosperity to this entire region," Morgan continued. "Jobs, commerce, civilization. But they need guarantees, Mrs. Hart. They need to know that the land they're investing in won't be tied up in legal disputes with stubborn widows who don't understand the bigger picture." "So you'll murder me for it," Liza said, her voice gaining strength. "I'll see justice done," Morgan corrected smoothly, "for the tragic death of Thomas Hart, a pillar of this community. If that justice happens to clear the way for progress, well, that's simply Providence at work." The trial had been a mockery from start to finish. Judge Morrison, no relation to the colonel, though they shared a surprising number of business interests, presided over proceedings that felt more like a lynching than a legal hearing. The prosecution presented their case with theatrical flair. The grieving widow who stood to inherit everything, the convenient accident that left no witnesses, the damning evidence of poison in the victim's system. Liza's court-appointed defender, a nervous young man fresh from law school, seemed more interested in ending the proceedings quickly than in mounting any real defense. He raised few objections, called no witnesses, and delivered a closing argument that sounded more like a plea for mercy than a declaration of innocence. The jury, 12 men from town, all of whom had business dealings with Colonel Morgan, deliberated for less than an hour before returning their verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence was death by hanging, to be carried out at sunrise 3 days hence. Those 3 days in the condemned cell passed like a nightmare. Liza was allowed no visitors except the circuit preacher, who urged her to confess her sins and make peace with her Maker. She refused his entreaties, maintaining her innocence even as the gallows was erected in the town square outside her window. On the final night, as she lay on the narrow cot listening to the sound of hammers and saws, Liza found herself thinking about Nathan Cross. It had been 5 years since she'd seen him, 5 years since the day he'd ridden out of Willow Creek without a word of explanation. She'd married Thomas on the rebound, convincing herself that steady affection was better than the wild, passionate love she'd felt for Nathan. Nathan had been different from the other men in town, darker, more dangerous, with secrets in his gray eyes and a restlessness that made him unsuitable for the settled life of a rancher's wife. But oh, how she'd loved him. Even now, facing death, she could remember the feel of his hands in her hair, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only woman in the world. Where was he now? Did he even know what was happening to her? Would he care if he did? As dawn approached, Liza pushed thoughts of Nathan aside. He was part of her past, and she was about to have no future. Whatever had driven him away from Willow Creek, whatever life he'd built for himself elsewhere, it had nothing to do with her anymore. The guards came for her as the sun painted the eastern sky pink and gold. They bound her hands, placed the rough hemp rope around her neck, and led her out to face whatever justice Colonel Morgan had purchased for her. But as she stood on the platform, feeling the morning breeze on her face and listening to Sheriff Coleman read the charges one final time, Liza caught sight of something that made her heart stop. A lone rider was cresting the hill at the edge of town, his horse lathered and blowing, his silhouette achingly familiar against the dawn sky. Nathan Cross had come home. Nathan Cross had been riding hard for 3 days, pushing his horses to their limits and switching mounts at every way station between Denver and Willow Creek. The telegram had reached him at his hotel in the territorial capital, where he'd been tracking down a particularly elusive bounty. The message had been brief but devastating. Elizabeth Hart condemned to hang for husband's murder. Execution set for dawn, April 15th. Come quickly if you can. Doc Williams. The irony wasn't lost on Nathan that the same doctor who'd helped frame Liza was the one warning him of her fate. Williams was a weak man, easily bought but not entirely without conscience. Apparently even he had limits to how far he'd go for Colonel Morgan's gold. Nathan had abandoned his bounty without a second thought. 5 years of trying to forget Elizabeth Hart, 5 years of telling himself he'd made the right choice in leaving, and now he was racing back to save the woman he'd never stopped loving. As his horse thundered down the main street of Willow Creek, Nathan could see the crowd gathered in the town square, could make out the wooden platform and the figure in the faded blue dress standing beneath the hangman's noose. His heart clenched at the sight of Liza, older, thinner, but still beautiful, still defiant even in the face of death. "Stop!" Nathan's voice boomed across the square as he brought his horse to a sliding halt near the platform. "Stop this execution!" Sheriff Coleman looked up in surprise, his hand frozen on the lever that would drop the trapdoor. "Nathan Cross? What in the hell are you doing here?" Nathan swung down from his horse, his hand instinctively checking the colt at his hip. He was dressed in black leather and worn denim, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, every inch the dangerous bounty hunter he'd become. The crowd parted before him like water, recognizing the deadly competence in his movements. "I'm here to stop a miscarriage of justice," Nathan announced, his gray eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. "This woman is innocent." Colonel Morgan stepped forward from the crowd, his face a mask of polite confusion. "Mr. Cross, isn't it? I'm afraid you're mistaken. Mrs. Hart has been tried and convicted by a jury of her peers. The law must take its course." Nathan's smile was cold as winter steel. "The law, Colonel? Is that what you call this circus?" His gaze swept over the assembled townspeople, many of whom looked away when he stared at them directly. "I know what this is really about. I know about the railroad deal, about the water rights, about the fortune you stand to make from this woman's death." A murmur ran through the crowd. Many of the townspeople had suspected Colonel Morgan's involvement, but had been too afraid to voice their doubts. Nathan's accusations gave voice to their unspoken fears. "That's a serious allegation," Morgan replied smoothly. "Do you have any proof of these wild claims?" Nathan reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "As a matter of fact, I do. This is a copy of the contract between you and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, signed 3 months before Thomas Hart's death. Funny how you were so certain you'd be able to deliver the Hart Ranch water rights, considering the property wasn't for sale." Morgan's composure slipped slightly. "Business is built on opportunity, Mr. Cross. When opportunities arise, wise men position themselves to take advantage. Is that what you call murder? An opportunity?" The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Sheriff Coleman shifted nervously, his hand moving toward his gun. But Nathan's reputation as a fast draw was legendary in these parts. Few men were foolish enough to test their speed against Nathan Cross. "I demand to see that document," Judge Morrison called out from the platform. But when Nathan handed it over, the judge's face went pale as he read the details. The contract was damning. It clearly showed that Morgan had promised to deliver the Hart Ranch to the railroad, regardless of whether the current owner was willing to sell. "This proves nothing," Morgan protested, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Contingency planning is not a crime." "No," Nathan agreed, "but murder is. And I have evidence that Thomas Hart was killed, not by his wife, but by your men." Nathan turned to address the crowd directly. "5 years ago, I left this town because I couldn't stand to watch good people be crushed by men like Colonel Morgan. But I never stopped caring about what happened here. I never stopped watching." He pulled out another document, a sheriff's report from a neighboring county. 3 weeks ago, a dying man named Jake Sullivan confessed to the murder of Thomas Hart. Sullivan was one of Morgan's hired guns, brought in specifically to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of the railroad deal. The crowd erupted in angry voices. Nathan raised his hand for silence and continued. "According to Sullivan's confession, he and another man ambushed Thomas Hart near the creek. They used a sap to knock him unconscious, then held his head underwater until he drowned. The arsenic was introduced post-mortem, injected into the body to throw suspicion onto Mrs. Hart." Dr. Williams stepped forward from the crowd, his face ashen with guilt. "It's true," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "Colonel Morgan paid me to alter my findings, to claim I'd found arsenic when I hadn't. I was desperate. My practice was failing, and he offered me enough money to start over somewhere else." The confession seemed to unlock a floodgate. Mrs. Henderson admitted she'd been paid to lie about selling rat poison to Liza. Billy Patterson confessed that he'd been coached to fabricate the story about overhearing an argument. One by one, Morgan's carefully constructed web of lies began to unravel. "This is preposterous," Morgan sputtered, but his protests were drowned out by the angry voices of the crowd. People who had been too afraid to speak out before were now shouting accusations, demanding justice for the innocent woman they'd been prepared to watch hang. Sheriff Coleman, seeing which way the wind was blowing, quickly moved to untie Liza's bonds and remove the noose from her neck. She collapsed to her knees on the platform, overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of her fortune. Nathan was beside her in an instant, his strong arms helping her to her feet. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, 5 years of separation and hurt and longing passing between them in a single glance. "You came back," Liza whispered, her voice hoarse from the rope's pressure. "I never really left," Nathan replied, his thumb gently wiping away the tear that had escaped down her cheek. "Not in any way that mattered." The crowd was calling for Colonel Morgan's arrest, but when they turned to look for him, he had vanished. In the chaos of revelation and confession, the man who had orchestrated it all had slipped away like smoke. "Let him run," Nathan said grimly. "A man like Morgan leaves a trail wherever he goes. I'll find him eventually." But for now, all that mattered was that Liza was safe, that justice had prevailed, and that the woman he'd never stopped loving was back in his arms where she belonged. The nightmare was over. The real story was just beginning. The aftermath of the failed execution was chaos. Angry townspeople demanded answers. Sheriff Coleman tried to maintain order while secretly wondering if he could salvage his career, and Colonel Morgan's remaining supporters melted away like snow in spring sunshine. But Nathan Cross had work to do. While Liza was taken to Dr. Williams's office to recover from her ordeal, Nathan commandeered the sheriff's office to conduct his investigation. He spread documents across Coleman's desk like a general planning a campaign: railroad contracts, land surveys, witness statements, and telegrams from contacts across the territory. "How long have you known?" Liza asked from the doorway. She'd cleaned up and changed into a simple green dress that Dr. Williams's wife had provided, but she still looked fragile, like a woman who'd stared death in the face and lived to tell about it. Nathan looked up from his papers, struck again by her beauty. 5 years had changed her. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, a hardness in her expression born of struggle and loss. But she was still the woman who'd stolen his heart all those years ago. "I suspected something was wrong when I heard about Thomas's death," Nathan admitted. "He was too good a horseman to die in a simple accident. But I didn't know how bad things had gotten until Doc Williams sent me that telegram." "Why did he warn you?" He was part of Morgan's scheme. Nathan's expression darkened. Williams is weak, not evil. When he realized Morgan intended to actually let you hang, it was too much for his conscience. He reached out to me because he knew I'd... He paused, searching for the right words. Because you knew I'd what? Lisa prompted. Because he knew I'd never let anything happen to you, Nathan finished quietly. No matter what passed between us before, the air between them grew thick with unspoken history. Liza stepped into the office, closing the door behind her. Nathan, about why you left? We don't need to talk about that now, Nathan interrupted, though his eyes never left her face. Right now, we need to focus on finishing what Morgan started. He's still out there, and he's still dangerous. But Liza wasn't willing to let the subject drop. Yes, we do need to talk about it. You disappeared without a word, Nathan. One day you were talking about marriage, about building a life together, and the next day you were gone. I mourned you like you were dead. Nathan's jaw clenched. You married Thomas Hart 6 months later. Because I thought you were never coming back. Liza's voice rose, years of hurt and confusion pouring out. Because you left me with no explanation, no goodbye, nothing but questions and a broken heart. I left because I had to, Nathan said harshly. Because staying would have destroyed both of us. That's not an answer. That's an excuse. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the town square where she'd nearly died. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with old pain. I left because Colonel Morgan threatened to kill you if I didn't. The words hit Liza like a physical blow. She sank into a chair, staring at Nathan in shock. What? Morgan wanted your water rights even back then, Nathan explained. But as long as you were unmarried, he couldn't pressure you to sell. A woman needs a husband's permission for such transactions, but a spinster with a dangerous boyfriend might cause complications. The pieces began falling into place for Liza. So he threatened you. He said if I married you, you'd have an unfortunate accident within the month. If I stayed in town as your suitor, the same thing would happen. The only way to keep you safe was to leave and never come back. Why didn't you tell me? Nathan's laugh was bitter. Tell you what? That the most powerful man in the territory wanted you dead, and the only way to protect you was to break your heart. That I was too much of a coward to stay and fight for you? You're not a coward, Liza said fiercely. You came back. You saved my life. I came back too late. You married Thomas, built a life, and I became what I needed to become to survive without you. The pain in his voice was almost unbearable. Liza reached across the desk and took his hand in hers. Nathan, I need you to understand something. I cared for Thomas, but I never loved him the way I loved you. He knew that. We both went into that marriage with our eyes open, looking for companionship rather than passion. He was a good man, and he deserved better than a wife who was still in love with someone else. Nathan's fingers tightened around hers. Liza, I never stopped loving you, she whispered. Even when I hated you for leaving, even when I convinced myself I was happy with Thomas, you were always there in the back of my mind. You were the standard I measured everything against. Before Nathan could respond, the office door burst open. Sheriff Coleman stumbled in, his face pale and his shirt torn. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead. Morgan's back, he gasped. He's got men with him. A lot of men. They've taken over the bank and they're holding hostages. Nathan was on his feet instantly, checking his weapons. How many? At least a dozen, maybe more. Professional gunmen by the look of them. They're demanding safe passage out of town and $50,000 from the bank vault. He's making his final play, Nathan said grimly. With his conspiracy exposed, he's got nothing left to lose. He'll burn this whole town down rather than face justice. Liza stood as well, her face set with determination. What can I do to help? You can stay here where it's safe, Nathan replied automatically. Like hell, Liza shot back. This is my fight too, Nathan. Morgan tried to kill me, destroyed my life, murdered my husband. I'm not hiding while you face him alone. Nathan wanted to argue, but one look at her face told him it would be useless. This was the Liza he remembered, fierce, stubborn, brave to a fault. She wouldn't be kept on the sidelines while others fought her battles. "Can you still shoot?" he asked. Liza's smile was sharp as a blade. "Thomas made sure I could handle any gun we owned. Said a rancher's wife needed to be able to protect herself and her property." Nathan nodded, making a quick decision. "Coleman, round up every man in town who can handle a gun. We're going to surround the bank and end this." "What about the hostages?" Coleman asked. "We'll get them out," Nathan promised. "But first, we're going to finish what Morgan started. One way or another, this ends today." As they prepared for the final confrontation, Nathan caught Liza's hand one more time. "After this is over, we need to talk. Really talk. About the past, about the future, about everything." Liza nodded, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'd like that." Outside, the town of Willow Creek prepared for war. The Willow Creek Bank stood at the corner of Main Street and First Avenue, a solid brick building that had weathered 15 years of frontier life. Now it was under siege, with Colonel Morgan and his hired guns barricaded inside, while the townspeople gathered in the street outside, unsure of how to proceed. Nathan surveyed the situation from the cover of the general store across the street. Morgan had chosen his fortress well. The bank had only two entrances, front and back, with thick walls and small windows that would make any assault costly. More importantly, he had hostages. Bank President William Morrison, the judge's brother, two tellers, and Mrs. Patterson, who'd had the misfortune of being inside when Morgan's men took over. "We can't just charge in there," Sheriff Coleman said nervously. "He'll kill the hostages." "Morgan's not going to kill anyone unnecessarily," Nathan replied, still studying the building. "Dead hostages are worthless to him. He needs them alive to guarantee his escape." "So what's your plan?" Liza asked. She'd insisted on positioning herself next to Nathan despite his protests, armed with Thomas's Colt .45 and a determined expression. Nathan was quiet for a moment, thinking. Morgan's a chess player, always thinking 3 moves ahead, but he's also a coward who lets other people do his dirty work. He's counting on us being too afraid for the hostages to make a move. "And are we?" Coleman asked. "No," Nathan said firmly, "because we're not going to give him what he expects." Nathan's plan was audacious in its simplicity. While the townsmen created a distraction at the front of the bank, Nathan and Liza would approach from the rear. But instead of trying to break in, they would wait for Morgan to make his inevitable run for freedom. "He'll try to escape through the back when he realizes we're not going to meet his demands," Nathan explained. "Morgan's too proud to surrender, and he's too smart to think he can hold out indefinitely. When he runs, we'll be waiting." As the sun reached its zenith, Nathan gave the signal. Sheriff Coleman and a dozen townsmen approached the front of the bank, calling for Morgan to release the hostages and surrender. The response was immediate and predictable. Gunfire from the windows and shouted demands for safe passage. Meanwhile, Nathan and Liza crept through the alley behind the bank. The back door was guarded by 2 of Morgan's men, tough-looking characters with the cold eyes of professional killers. Nathan motioned for Liza to stay back, then moved forward with the fluid grace of a predator. The first guard never knew what hit him. Nathan's knife found the gap between his ribs with surgical precision, and the man dropped silently to the ground. The second guard turned at the sound of his partner's fall, but Nathan was already moving. A swift blow to the throat dropped the second man, gasping and choking, but alive. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," Liza whispered as they dragged the unconscious guards into the shadows. "You were on my bad side for 5 years, Nathan replied with a grim smile. "Look how that turned out." They positioned themselves on either side of the back door and waited. The gunfire from the front of the building continued sporadically, but Nathan could sense the tension building inside the bank. Morgan would be getting nervous, realizing that his demands weren't going to be met. The wait wasn't long. The back door opened cautiously, and one of Morgan's men peered out, checking for threats. Finding none, he signaled to someone inside, and moments later, Colonel Morgan himself appeared, flanked by 2 more gunmen. Morgan looked every inch the defeated aristocrat. His usually immaculate appearance was disheveled, his silver hair unkempt, his expensive suit rumpled and stained with sweat. But his eyes still held the calculating intelligence that had made him dangerous. "The horses are in the stable behind Morrison's store," Morgan was saying to his men as they emerged from the bank. "We'll ride hard for the territorial border. Once we're in New Mexico, we can... Going somewhere, Colonel? Nathan stepped out of the shadows, his Colt already drawn and aimed at Morgan's chest. Morgan's face went white, then flushed red with rage. Nathan Cross, I should have killed you 5 years ago when I had the chance. You should have tried, Nathan replied coolly. But you always were better at hiring other people to do your killing. Morgan's two remaining gunmen reached for their weapons, but froze when Liza appeared from the other side of the doorway, her own gun trained on them with rock-steady hands. I wouldn't, she said softly. I've got nothing left to lose, and I'm feeling a mite trigger-happy after spending the morning with a rope around my neck. Mrs. Hart, Morgan said, attempting to regain his composure. How lovely to see you alive and well. I do hope there are no hard feelings about this morning's misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? Lisa's voice was deadly quiet. You murdered my husband. You tried to steal my land. You nearly had me hanged for a crime I didn't commit. And you call that a misunderstanding? Business, my dear. Nothing personal. You made it personal when you killed Thomas? Morgan's facade finally cracked completely. Your husband was a fool who stood in the way of progress. That land should have been mine by rights. I offered him a fair price, just like I offered you. But no, you Harts were too stubborn, too proud to see the bigger picture. The bigger picture? Nathan's voice was like ice. You mean your deal with the railroad? The millions you stood to make by controlling the water rights? Civilization costs money, Cross. The railroad will bring prosperity to this entire territory. Jobs, commerce, growth. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the greater good. Whose greater good? Liza demanded. Yours? The railroads? What about the people who were already here? The families who built their lives on this land? Cattle ranchers and dirt farmers, Morgan spat. Small thinkers who can't see beyond their own fence lines. This territory needs vision, needs leaders who understand that progress requires bold action. Progress built on murder and theft, Nathan said. That's not civilization, Morgan. That's just greed dressed up in fancy words. The standoff continued for several tense seconds, both sides waiting for the other to make a move. Then from inside the bank came the sound of voices. Sheriff Coleman and his men had managed to breach the front entrance and were securing the hostages. Morgan's eyes darted between Nathan and Liza, calculating odds and options. You can't prove anything, he said desperately. Sullivan's confession won't hold up in court, the word of a dying criminal against a respected businessman. The arsenic in Thomas's body is still evidence of poisoning. And who's to say I didn't arrive in town just in time to prevent a terrible miscarriage of justice? You're forgetting something, Colonel, Nathan said with a cold smile. I've got 5 years' worth of evidence against you. Bank records showing payments to known criminals, contracts with the railroad signed before you had any legal right to the Hart Ranch, witnesses who saw your men near the Hart property the day Thomas died. Nathan reached into his coat and withdrew a thick folder of documents. I've been building a case against you for months, Morgan. Every dirty deal, every bribe, every threat. The territorial marshal is very interested in what I've collected. Morgan's face went ashen. You're bluffing? Am I? Tell me, Colonel, what do you think happened to Jake Sullivan after he confessed to killing Thomas Hart? Did you really think he just conveniently died of his wounds? The truth hit Morgan like a physical blow. You saved him, brought him to testify. Sullivan's in protective custody in Denver, ready to tell his story to a federal judge, along with Doc Williams, Mrs. Henderson, Billy Patterson, and half a dozen other people you thought you owned. For the first time since Nathan had known him, Colonel James Morgan looked truly defeated. His shoulders sagged, his aristocratic bearing crumbled, and he seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. It's over, Morgan, Liza said quietly. No more running, no more scheming. Justice is finally going to be served. But Nathan knew men like Morgan never went quietly. Even cornered and beaten, they were dangerous. He saw the desperate calculation in the colonel's eyes, the slight shift in posture that meant he was about to make a play. Liza, get back! Nathan shouted as Morgan suddenly lunged forward, a hidden derringer appearing in his hand. The next few seconds passed in a blur of gunfire and chaos. Morgan's shot went wide as Nathan tackled him, the two men crashing to the ground in a tangle of limbs. One of Morgan's gunmen tried to draw on Liza, but her husband's training served her well. Her Colt barked once, and the man dropped with a bullet in his shoulder. The second gunman, seeing his employer down and his partner wounded, threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender. "Don't shoot! I yield!" Nathan climbed off Morgan's unconscious form, checking the derringer that had fallen from the colonel's hand. "Looks like your boss hit his head on the way down," he said to the surrendering gunman. "He'll live, but he's going to wake up in a jail cell." Sheriff Coleman and his men emerged from the bank, herding the remaining members of Morgan's gang. The hostages were shaken but unharmed, and word was already spreading through the town that the crisis was over. "What happens now?" Liza asked as they watched Coleman place shackles on the unconscious Morgan. "Now he faces justice," Nathan replied. "A real trial, with real evidence, in front of a federal judge who hasn't been bought and paid for. He'll spend the rest of his life in prison, if he's lucky." "And us?" Liza's voice was soft, uncertain. "What happens to us?" Nathan turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious but warm. "That depends on what you want, Liza. I know I hurt you by leaving. I know 5 years is a long time, and people change. If you want me to ride away again, I will. But this time, it would be because you asked me to, not because I'm running from a fight." Liza stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes. "I spent 5 years wondering what my life would have been like if you'd stayed. I don't want to spend the next 5 wondering what it would be like if you left again." "Then I'm staying," Nathan said simply. "For as long as you'll have me." "What about your work?" "Being a bounty hunter?" Nathan's smile was soft and genuine for the first time since he'd returned to Willow Creek. "I think it's time I found a new line of work. Maybe something more settled, more domestic." "Such as?" "Well, I hear there's a ranch outside town that might need a good foreman. Beautiful property, excellent water rights, very attractive owner." Liza laughed, the sound like music after the darkness of the past few days. "I think that could be arranged. But I should warn you, the owner can be quite demanding. She expects her employees to work hard, pull their weight, and Nathan prompted, stepping even closer. "And she's been known to fall in love with the help." Nathan's arms came around her waist, pulling her against him. "Well, in that case, I think I'm going to like this job very much." As their lips met in the dusty alley behind the Willow Creek bank, neither of them heard the cheers from the townspeople in the street, or the sound of Colonel Morgan being dragged away in chains. All that mattered was this moment, this second chance, this promise of a future built on truth instead of lies. The nightmare was finally over. The dream was just beginning. 3 months later, the Hart Ranch was thriving in ways it hadn't seen since Thomas's death. The autumn roundup had brought in more cattle than Liza had dared hope for. The water rights dispute was settled in her favor by federal court, and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad had been forced to find an alternate route that didn't involve stolen land. Nathan had proven to be everything Liza could have asked for in a ranch foreman: knowledgeable, hardworking, and completely devoted to both the land and its owner. He'd hired back most of the men who'd been driven away by Morgan's intimidation, and the ranch was once again a bustling center of activity. But more than that, Nathan had proven to be the partner Liza had always dreamed of. Unlike her marriage to Thomas, which had been built on mutual respect and practical considerations, her relationship with Nathan was a partnership of equals, passionate and deep, and built on a foundation of shared dreams. On a crisp October morning, Liza stood on the front porch of the ranch house, watching Nathan work with a new horse in the corral. He moved with the same patience and skill she remembered from their youth, but there was something different about him now, a sense of peace, of belonging that had been missing 5 years ago. "He's a natural with the animals," came a voice from behind her. Liza turned to see Dr. Williams approaching, his medical bag in hand, and a sheepish expression on his weathered face. "Dr. Williams," Liza said coolly. Despite his role in exposing Morgan's conspiracy, she still harbored resentment toward the man who'd nearly helped send her to the gallows. "Mrs. Hart," Williams replied, removing his hat, "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see, but I've brought something that I think belongs to you." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This was your husband's. I found it among Colonel Morgan's effects when they searched his office. I thought, I thought you should have it. Liza took the journal with trembling hands. She'd wondered what had happened to Thomas's private writings. He'd kept a daily record of ranch activities and personal thoughts that had disappeared after his death. There's something else, Williams continued reluctantly. Something you need to know about the day your husband died. Liza's blood chilled. What about it? Thomas came to see me that morning, before he rode out to check the creek. He was troubled about something. Said he discovered evidence that someone was planning to divert water from the creek illegally. He wanted me to examine the water quality downstream, see if anything unusual was happening. The revelation hit Liza like a physical blow. Thomas knew what Morgan was planning. Williams nodded miserably. I think he was gathering evidence to present to the territorial authorities. If he'd lived, Morgan's entire scheme would have been exposed months earlier. You think that's why they killed him? Not just to clear the way for the railroad, but to stop him from exposing the water theft? I'm certain of it. And Mrs. Hart, there's one more thing. That morning, Thomas asked me to give you a message if anything happened to him. He said to tell you that he knew you'd never loved him the way you loved Nathan Cross, but that he'd been honored to be your husband anyway. He said you deserved to be happy, and if Nathan ever came back, he hoped you'd give love a second chance. Tears streamed down Liza's face as she clutched the journal to her chest. Even in death, Thomas had been thinking of her happiness, giving her permission to love again. Thank you, she whispered to Williams, for telling me, for bringing this, for finding your conscience when it mattered. Williams nodded and turned to leave, then paused. Mrs. Hart? For what it's worth, I think Thomas would approve of your choice. Nathan Cross is a good man, and he loves you the way you deserve to be loved. After the doctor left, Liza sat on the porch reading Thomas's journal. His entries chronicled not just the daily life of the ranch, but his growing suspicions about Morgan's activities, his investigations into the water diversion, and his plans to expose the conspiracy. The final entry, dated the morning of his death, was heartbreaking in its prescience. If something happens to me, I pray that Liza will be strong enough to carry on. She deserves better than the quiet affection I've been able to give her. She deserves the kind of love that sets souls on fire. If Nathan Cross ever returns to Willow Creek, I hope she'll be brave enough to reach for happiness with both hands. That evening, Nathan found Liza sitting by the fireplace in the ranch house, the journal in her lap and tears on her cheeks. Without a word, he sat beside her and pulled her into his arms. Thomas knew, she said softly, her voice muffled against his chest. He knew about Morgan's plans. He knew about the water theft. He knew he was in danger. And he still rode out that morning because he thought he could stop it. He was a brave man, Nathan said quietly. A better man than I was, in many ways. No, Liza protested, pulling back to look at him. Different maybe, but not better. You both loved me in your own ways. Thomas gave me stability and kindness when I needed it most. But you give me passion and partnership and the kind of love I thought only existed in novels. Nathan's hands framed her face, his thumbs wiping away her tears. I love you, Elizabeth Hart. I loved you 5 years ago when I left. I loved you every day I was gone, and I'll love you until the day I die. But I need to know, can you forgive me for leaving? Can you trust me not to run again when things get difficult? Liza's answer came without hesitation. I forgave you the moment I understood why you left, and I trust you because you came back, because when I needed you most, when my life was hanging by a thread, you rode through hell to save me. I'd do it again, Nathan said fiercely, 1,000 times over. I know you would, and that's why I want to ask you something. Nathan waited, his heart pounding. Nathan Cross, will you marry me? His surprised laugh filled the room. Don't you think that's supposed to be my line? I'm tired of waiting for men to make decisions about my life, Liza said with a smile. I've learned to ask for what I want, and what I want is you. I want a real partnership, a marriage built on love and respect and shared dreams. I want to build something beautiful together on this land that's been watered with so much pain. Nathan's kiss was his answer, deep and passionate and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, He pressed his forehead against hers. Yes, he whispered. Yes to everything. Marriage, partnership, building a life together. Yes to loving you the way you deserve to be loved. Outside, the Colorado winds sang through the cottonwoods along Willow Creek, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly in the gathering dusk. The Hart Ranch, soon to be the Cross Ranch, settled into peaceful quiet. Its painful past finally laid to rest. The future stretched ahead of them like an unwritten page, full of possibilities and hope. They would face whatever came together as equals, as partners, as two souls who had found their way back to each other, despite all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. Love had conquered greed, truth had triumphed over lies, and justice had finally been served. It was, Liza thought as she fell asleep in Nathan's arms, the beginning of their real story. Years later, when travelers passed through Willow Creek, they'd often hear the story of the widow who nearly died for her land and the bounty hunter who rode back from the past to save her. Some versions made Nathan a mysterious stranger, others painted Liza as a helpless victim. But the folks who lived through those dark days knew the truth. They knew it was a story about courage in the face of corruption, about love strong enough to survive separation and betrayal, about two people who refused to let evil triumph over good. They'd point to the thriving Cross Ranch with its expanded herds and new buildings, where Nathan and Liza raised their children and proved that some partnerships are strong enough to weather any storm. The tale became legend in Colorado territory. A reminder that justice might be delayed, but it would not be denied. That love might be tested, but it could not be destroyed. And that sometimes, just sometimes, the good guys really do win in the end. So if this story stirred your heart, if you believe in love that's worth fighting for, and justice that's worth pursuing, show us some love. Hit that subscribe button for more tales of Wild West romance. Smash that like button if Nathan and Liza's story moved you. And drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We love connecting with our global community of Western romance fans. Are you team love conquers all? Or team justice delayed but not denied? Let us know in the comments, and if you know someone who believes in second chances and happy endings, share this story with them. Because out here in the West, the best stories are the ones where love conquers all.